Today we get into the most difficult part of the book of James. It is several verses that have confounded many Bible scholars, caused many arguments. The argument against it is that they say it seems to teach that you have to add works to your faith in order to be saved. It does not teach that. It teaches that faith must be real faith and not, as he put it, dead faith. The second problem, though, is how he deals with the chronology of Abraham's life, because he's going to use Abraham as his example. And he uses the life of Abraham as his example. Now, he is not unique in this. When Paul wants to tell us exactly what faith is, Paul goes to the life of Abraham to describe what faith is. He quotes in Genesis that Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness.
An interest in the Savior's blood, died he for me, who caused his pain, for me who him to death pursued.
That whole section I discussed in length about Romans 4 in a lesson that hopefully will be a tag up here. And in it, Paul quotes an event where Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness that occurs at one point in Abraham's life. Then he uses as an illustration of that an event that happened more than a decade later. Then we have the Hebrews writer, Hebrews 11, where it talks about one person after another, Noah, Abel, Jacob, that by faith they did this, by faith they did this, by faith they did this. When it comes to Abraham, it describes multiple things in Abraham's life. We're going to see why all these different points in Abraham's life are used. It'll be in more detail in the lesson in the series on Hebrews 11. Follow along in the series, starting with the first one about Abraham. I'm going to try to put a link to it. But here we're going to look at how James, quoting the same Abraham believed God, points to a different point in Abraham's life. One that is covered in Hebrews, but not in Romans 4. This lesson will be about James chapter 2 and verse 20. But I will be reading the entire paragraph so that we get the context. And I will be largely discussing the gist of the whole paragraph that this verse introduces. You foolish man, you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our ancestor Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And he was called God's friend. You see that a person is justified by what he does and not by faith alone. It's that last verse that gets people in big snarls and snits. We'll cover that as we get to that verse. But what's the gist of what's happening here? He quotes the scripture, Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness, which happened at the time when Abraham believed that he would become the father of many nations, that his ancestors would be like the stars in uncountability. And it says he believed God. It was counted to him as righteousness. But when we go back to Hebrews and we see that by faith, when did Abraham's faith start? When did his saving faith start? We see that he is given as an example of faith, of saving faith. By faith, he left the land where he lived to follow after God's call to a land that he never knew. Well, that was long before he looked up at the stars and believed God. But it says by faith. And it's talking about saving faith. So when did Abraham get saving faith? And the Bible doesn't tell us. What it does tell us is that by the time he left Haran, he had that faith. And that when he believed that God would multiply him like the stars, he had that faith, and God stated that his faith was credited to him as righteousness. And then when Paul talks about Abraham having a faith that was credited to him as righteousness, he gives an example of that faith. And the example is another decade and a half later, when Abraham believes that God will give him a son even though he is 99 years old and his wife is 90. And now James is going to talk about that same faith, the same faith, not a new faith, not, oh, now he got saving faith, but the same faith when God called him to offer Isaac, which we'll see in detail here and in Hebrews. But it's one faith, and it keeps being demonstrated over and over and over in works. Demonstrated in works. That's why the word perfect appears, I think, twice here. The word perfect, the word that is translated so often perfect in the King James, we think of it as being pure and unadulterated, morally without any stain. But that's not the primary meaning of the word. The primary meaning is made complete. It's the same word that Jesus used when you see the Greek version of it, when he said it is finished. It is made complete. The same concept. It is made complete. And so it says that his faith was made complete. Not like complete in the sense that his faith was lacking something. It wasn't quite saving faith. That's where this gets misinterpreted. People think, oh, it wasn't quite saving faith. We'll cover this again. It wasn't quite saving faith. No. It's saying that the whole story of how his life showed his faith, that whole story becomes a complete story when you see how far his faith went at the binding of Isaac. And so it becomes complete. The story of Abram's faith becomes complete. As it is written, he that endures to the end will be saved.